about 20 of them. It was as if they were moving one by one. We watched it for a while until the tornado disappeared behind the Uigilal's store. We ran and told everything to a friend's cousin. She got really scared, and we all ran home. At home my grandmother said it was an omen for something bad. I didn't know what to think myself. Ala Mesnikova, a resident of the village Sodency, an eyewitness. I was standing near the store. The wind blew in and raised dust, everything around became brown. There were some boys nearby and they showed me the tornado, inside which I could make out two shadows. I was standing in front of the store, and the wind blew up dust, and everything around me turned brown. As I wrote earlier, shamans were being cucked and persecuted under the Soviet rule, so there were few of them. But that doesn't mean that they all degenerated or that they used to be all charlatans. They just went underground, hid their abilities, suppressed their powers, and so on. I'll throw in too many stories with shamans in Soviet times. The first case took place in Stalinist times. In a small village in the central district, I think Namsky, there was a man who secretly provided the local shaman services. People used to say that if he didn't hide on purpose, he could have become a great shaman in the old days. Eventually, when people from other districts started coming to this man, the KGB secret police decided to take the propagator of obscurantism by the gills. So, they came especially for his sake, broke into the house, made a mess, and arrested him. They took him to Yakutsk on horses. It was a long way, until it got dark. And when it got dark, one of the guards suddenly noticed that the shaman's horse was riding without a rider. He could not have gone anywhere, he had just been here. No one saw him running away, and his hands were handcuffed, but he was gone. They raised a hue and cry, drove back, came to the village at midnight, and he was sleeping peacefully, having had a hearty dinner. They tied him up again, both his hands and feet, loaded him onto a cart, and drove him out into the night. Somewhere in the middle of the road the guard once again looks into the cart. He, again, was nowhere to be found. They got nervous, but what can you do? They had to go back, for the third time. The head of the escort talked to the shaman alone, pressed on the pity. He said that if he did not bring the shaman to town as was ordered, that then he himself would be put in jail. The shaman took pity and went with them without any handcuffs. They reached the city in the morning and immediately sent him to prison. But again there was a problem. As soon as the shaman entered the courtyard, with each step he began to swell, and by the time he thus reached the prison building, he had become so big and shapeless that he could not get in either the door or the window. With each step back, he shrank again. The prison guards were shocked and amazed. A big shot from the KGB saw this and told them to bring the shaman to him. It is unknown what they talked about, but after that he ordered him to be released in peace and even ordered that he be driven back to his home in the village at the expense of the treasury. The KGB never touched him again. After that he tried not to show off his skills too much, although he continued to help people in secret. The second case also happened about that time. This shaman lived in the Vili Yolis and was quite a well-off peasant. When collectivization reached the level of, if you don't go to the collective farm, you rot in prison, and it became clear that all his goods would be taken away from him anyway, he told everything to fuck off, transferred his farm to the collective farm, and went off to live in a woods, where he built himself a hut and hunted. He had a young relative who would periodically visit him, bring him booze and tell him the latest news. The shaman urged him to come in the morning or in the afternoon. He had his own business there in the evening. So, he did, but once he was too late, either he got lost or had business to attend to, and came to the cabin in the forest after sunset. It was summer, which is the time of white nights in Yakutia, so it was still quite bright. The guest went into the hut, and there was nobody there. He wondered where the man had gone to in the middle of the night. He went back out, listened, and there were voices in the woods behind the hut. That's when he felt uncomfortable. The woods, a lonely hiker, what the fuck kind of conversation is that? A little apprehensive, he went to look anyway. The voices came closer and closer, at least 3 or 4 different people, and one of them was clearly the shaman. Mainly he spoke, and others from time to time inserted something and nodded. The guest listened attentively. The dialogue was approximately as follows.
And I didn't do harm to people, so why am I being punished? Tell me, is it fair? They took away all my goods, and banished me to the woods like a useless old dog. Tell me, shall I bear such a wicked offense? And what must I do to restore my good name and regain my respect? Is there a way?
The voices didn't answer in a clone chorus, of course. but in different ways, and not in such a monosyllabic way. But that's not the point. In general, the young man was really shitting himself and did not listen any further to what they were talking about. As he stepped back, he vaguely saw the shaman sitting on a stump among the trees, propping his jaw with his hands, and some long dark creatures crowding in front of him. He did not look at them and ran off. When he came back in the morning and told the shaman what he had heard in the evening, he flatly denied it.
Fuck it, are you crazy? I'm the only one here. Who can I talk to? You should drink less.
That's the way it is. The story is incomplete because I don't know if this shaman actually got his stuff back afterwards. Something tells me he did. There is a small village in Yakutia called Iskati, 3 birches. Not far from the village, 15 kilometers away, in a clearing in the woods is an old house, where, according to rumors, the Abasi, that is, the devil, dwells. All people who live in the village avoid this house. As you know, during the days of the Soviet Union, people were taught that nothing supernatural exists. And for some reason known only to the officials themselves, the council of the district center decided to send an expedition to that house to prove that there are no otherworldly forces there. The expedition consisted of 10 people, almost all were party officials from the district center, among them were only a couple of locals, including the head of the village council, who did not want to go. But had to go, after all, the head, if he refused, he would be removed from office. They went by truck, and took a case of vodka with them. They arrived at the place, unloaded, went into the house, which consisted of one big room. In the old days they built it that way. Inside, everything was relatively clean. There was a stove and a table. Our heroes first examined the house, all the holes and corners. They did not find anything suspicious. They dragged a crate of vodka into the house, started drinking and talking. Soon it was nighttime. People made their sleeping bags on the floor and fell asleep. And then one of the guests suddenly felt someone pulling down his blanket. He pulled it back to him, and then someone abruptly ripped the blanket out of his hands. The man quickly got out of bed, looked around, everyone was asleep.
Stop it, it's not funny.
He exclaimed, thinking it was one of the others fucking with him. Near the opposite wall another guy stood up.
What is it? Don't make an nice. You already disturbing to sleep.
And then the kettle, which was standing on the stove, flew at this guy's head all by itself.
What's wrong?
The guy exclaimed, grabbed the kettle and threw it back towards the stove. Seconds later the kettle came flying again. Everyone woke up as a result of the commotion. They turned on their flashlights and calmed down. There seemed to be no one in the house but them. And then heavy footsteps were heard outside the front door and someone shouted, "Yeah!" The front door opened, and everyone was horrified to see that behind the threshold stood a man, covering the whole of the door frame. Next thing they came to on the road outside the village. Everyone was walking one by one, barefoot and lightly dressed. It was almost morning. Nobody remembered anything, even though they had walked half a dozen kilometers. Barefoot, their feet were bleeding. In this strange way they returned to the village, but their belongings and weapons were still in the house. The members of the expedition started asking the locals to go back there and get their things. No one agreed for a long time, but then they found 3 hunters who were promised money and a case of vodka for the feat. The hunters arrived at the glade in the afternoon, quickly went in, gathered their things in an armful without looking, and jumped back out. My uncle, who heard it from a direct participant in the story, told me this. He said his hands were shaking as he recalled that terrible night. Yakut, Abbas, are not some corporeal monsters like the chupacabra, but a kind of projection from another world, and it is often pointless and even dangerous to punch them in the face from a U-turn, like in that story about the Suliukuns, where the Abasi fucked up a guy in an old house. Although there were some recommendations on how to deal with them in the local folklore, for example, that the Abasi can be chased away if you throw a Yakut knife at him with your left hand outward from the palm. And stuff like that. Some small subspecies of evil are afraid of cold steel, like the calf eater I wrote about before, but not many of them. With firearms, by the way, the situation is somehow different. Usually, if hunters shoot at Abbases with their shotguns, they are incapacitated, but usually only for a short time. So, if you encounter an Abasi of uncertain origin, don't engage in a one-on-one battle with it. It's better to just walk away, but not screaming and running. They might chase you, then to box with it in an empty house. And while I'm at it, here's a cool story, unrelated to the text I wrote above. It just came to mind. The time of action was in the 70s. There was a Yakut village family with 2 children. The boy was several years younger than his sister and was growing up very sickly. At the same time, the girl said that these injuries and sores were because of some guests who were invisible to adults, and then things began to happen to her little brother. No one really believed her. After she grew up, the girl told in detail about several particularly memorable cases. The first case: they were both playing near the house in the sandpit, and suddenly the girl noticed that some old woman in white tattered clothes was standing near the barn, looking at her little brother. She was not surprised at first, maybe some acquaintance had come to see her grandmother? But then, when the old woman had been there motionless for several minutes, the girl began to suspect something was wrong. She noticed that the woman had no shadow. The barn next door had a shadow, but she didn't. The frightened girl grabbed her little brother and dragged him into the house, while the old woman remained watching the boy. That same evening, the boy became seriously ill and took a long time to recover. The second incident: a family was having dinner in the house, eating fish. Suddenly the girl noticed that a severed female head with long fluttering hair floated through the air outside the window. Her mouth was moving, as if she were humming something. No sooner had the girl been frightened than her brother choked on a fish bone. It went all the way to the hospital. The third case: adults were not at home, children played together. Suddenly, glancing out the window, the girl saw a tall stranger standing on the other side of the window, his face very wide and red like a tomato, and looking at her brother steadily. She was frightened, looked at her brother, and he, who had been playing quietly with his toys, suddenly got up, ran over to the big barrel with water. It was winter. In the villages at this time of year they usually filled up the water in big vessels in the house for a few days ahead. Climbed on the chair which stood near the barrel and put his head down into the barrel, full of water. Of course, he could not get out on his own. If he had been alone, he would have drowned. The girl was exhausted pulling him out. The boy managed to get the water into his lungs, but the clever girl called the neighbors and they quickly performed CPR on him and took the hapless boy to the hospital. Once again, the boy lived till the end of school, but during another attack of either flu or something else he passed away. The girl lived a long time, and she told me about her strange encounters. A group of archaeology students from Yakutsk State University in the 60s went on a summer expedition to one of the remote northern regions of the Republic. They excavated and studied graves in some ancient cemetery. At first it was awkward, then nothing and long periods of boredom. They got used to it. Then one of them suggested that they drive for a day to some Alas, where there is a lake where they could swim secretly, away from the eyes of the villagers. The trick was that on the outskirts of this Alas was the grave of some local shaman whom the villagers greatly revered. Some students dissuaded their friends from this undertaking, but still it was the Soviet time, atheism and other hollow materialism. In the end about a dozen people, the majority of the group, were willing to go hiking. They came, settled near the lake, played ball, had a sweet, and drank. After a certain amount of alcohol, when intoxicated enough, they went to look for that very grave of the shaman, and even found it with no trouble, as it was in plain view, such an ancient grave, and the body was in a closed wooden solitary vault on the surface. Such a structure is called arangas. Some of the dickheads got excited about the idea of opening up the arangas and looking at the remains. After all, they were archaeologists, right? The girls, who drank less, still talked the guys out of this idea, but they still did a lot of things they shouldn't have done. Yelling, littering, etc. Especially the 2 drunken guys who just took a piss at the base of the arangas did a great job. With that, they returned to a large communal tent pitched by the lake, where they went to bed. At night they woke up to a real storm brewing outside. They didn't dare go out into this weather and just lay there, listening to the eerie noise of the wind. Suddenly,